A man of 174 centimeters, recessive chin, round-frame glasses, stomach permanently troubled by psychosomatic pains. He was not a brilliant general. He was not an orator like Goebbels or a strategist like Rommel. He was a son of the Bavarian bourgeoisie who had failed as a farmer, who never got to fight at the front, who fainted when he saw excess blood, and who at the same time supervised the most sophisticated apparatus of terror the world had ever known. On October 7, 1900, the second son of Gebhard Himmler, grammar teacher and former private tutor of Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, was born in Munich. The boy was named after his royal godfather, Heinrich. That connection with the Wittelsbach house was not decorative. It marked the entire childhood. Father Gebhard was a man of sustained aspirations, obsessed with decorum, manners, school discipline, and loyalty to the monarchy. She kept a meticulous control of her children's academic progress, monitored her friendships, corrected their summer diaries, taught them stenography and philately as exercises in patience. Physically weak, infection-prone, with a build that his classmates would remember decades later as strikingly sickly, little Heinrich learned early on that visibility was earned with perfect obedience and impeccable grades. When World War I broke out, Heinrich was 14 years old. His diary of those months is a revealing mix. Entries about Prussian victories copied from telegrams in the local newspaper, interspersed with notes about the times he had gone swimming that summer. 37 times, according to the count itself. But the war fascinated him with an intensity that transcended strategy games with his friend Volk Zipperer. In August 1914 he wrote, "Volk and I played fencing, this time with 40 Army Corps and Russia, France and Belgium against Germany and Austria. The game is very interesting." His older brother Gebhard joined the army in 1917. So does his best friend Volk. Heinrich, who belonged to the so-called youth war generation, was too young for the front. He tried. He pressured his father to use his contacts at court and enroll him in the most distinguished infantry regiment in Bavaria. The lists were full. He spent months from course to course, from barracks to barracks, but the armistice came on November 11, 1918, before he could fire a single shot. It did not become official. He did not make it to the front. The fact would haunt him all his life. Years later, in speeches to Wehrmacht generals, he would drop phrases such as, "In 1917, I became an ensign, and as a young man, I lived through the revolution," omitting that he had spent most of his time at home with his parents. Peter Longerich, in his definitive biography of Himmler, published by Oxford University Press in 2012, notes that no press document claiming that Himmler had served at the front was ever corrected by him. The frustration of that failure was the fuel for everything that came later. After the war, with his military career closed, Heinrich enrolled at the Technical University of Munich to study agriculture. The choice surprised his own family. The Himmlers were city people, middle-class professionals with no ties to the countryside. But Heinrich had calculated, in the Faculty of Agronomy, he would find demobilized officers who, like him, were looking for a reunion with military life. During the pre-career internship year, he worked on a farm in Oberhaunstadt, on the estate of economic advisor Winter, 12 hours of daily work 6 days a week. He carried only 105 sacks of rye, of 2 quintals each on an afternoon in August 1919, as he proudly noted in his work diary. But the body, which was never his ally, betrayed him in less than 5 weeks. He was admitted to the hospital in Ingolstadt with suspected paratyphus. The family doctor detected heart enlargement and prescribed rest. In convalescence, he read voraciously Jules Verne, Bavarian historical novels, Goethe's Faust, and also, already in that autumn of 1919, his first openly anti-Semitic book, a pamphlet against the Freemasons by Friedrich Wichtel, an Austrian MP who identified Freemasonry with Judaism and blamed both for the German defeat in the war. Himmler's notation in the book's margin read, "A book that illuminates everything and tells us who we have to fight first." He graduated in July 1919 without having passed the formal exam, thanks to a special decree for veterans. Later, He worked briefly in a fertilizer manufacturing company in Schleißheim. The business failed. In 1922, he left it. He was already fully involved in the National Socialist movement. The man who would build the largest police apparatus in European history had been, before the age of 30, a landless agronomy student, a fertilizer company worker with no professional future, and a mediocre amateur poet who wrote verses with his friend Falk Zipperer. That mediocrity was not an accident of history. It was his engine. In the autumn of 1919, Himmler was torn between two worlds that he could not reconcile, the Catholic faith of his upbringing and the racial anti-Semitism that was beginning to seduce him in Munich's student circles. The specific dispute was the so-called dueling affair, whether Jews could be members of university fraternities with the right to mourn. German-speaking fraternities in Austria had been excluding them for decades. Radical-leaning students wanted the same thing in Munich. But the Himmler of 1919 was still a practicing member of the Catholic Church, which opposed this marginalization. His diary of December 4, 1919, records the tension with a frankness that he would rarely show again. After dinner, I had a conversation about Judaism, questions of honor, and so on. A very interesting discussion. I was thinking about it on my way home. I think I'm heading toward a conflict with my religion. 3 days later, no matter what happens, I will always love God and pray to Him, and I will belong to the Catholic Church and defend it, even if I am excluded from it. That tension was resolved slowly, without a dramatic rupture visible from the outside. By 1925, when he joined the NSDAP, Catholicism had been reduced to a useful tool for certain moments. Racial anti-Semitism was already his central cosmology. But what is remarkable about Longerich is that he points out something uncomfortable, that anti-Semitism was never the absolute center of Himmler's worldview. He was part of a broader, diffuse enemy, which also included Freemasons, Jesuits, homosexuals, and above all, Christianity itself. The Jews were the core, but Himmler's enemies were all those who threatened the reconstruction of a fanciful Germanic race. What interested him most, deep down, was anti-Christianity. When Heinrich Himmler took office as Reichsführer SS in January 1929, the SS had just 280 members. They were a protective guard subordinate to the SA, Ernst Röhm's stormtroopers, the real paramilitary force of the party. The SS was, at that time, secondary, despised, almost ornamental. In November 1931, one of its regional commanders reported in a memorandum that he had managed to increase the strength of his standard from 18 to 600 men in a few months. It was the typical pattern of that explosive growth. By the end of 1931, the total exceeded 15,000. After the temporary ban on paramilitary groups in April 1932, which was lifted in June, the SS went from 25,000 to more than 41,000 affiliates in a matter of weeks. By the time Hitler took power in January 1933, the number exceeded 52,000. How did he do it? Longerich identifies a management principle that Himmler applied with an almost monotonous consistency. He systematically sought out failed men, and they became dependent. The officers of the First World War who had not found their place in the Weimar Republic, the law students who could not get a place in the civil service, the merchants ruined by the inflation of 1923 and the crisis of 1929. He offered the same thing to everyone: a career, an identity, a place in an elite that presented itself as the guard of the Germanic future. In return, he demanded absolute loyalty. But that loyalty was not abstract. It was personal, addressed to him. A study of SS personnel files reveals a pattern. Himmler accepted men with compromising histories, alcoholism, debts, suspended sentences, into leadership positions as long as a direct dependency relationship could be established. The man you rescue from the bottom owes his rehabilitation solely to you, and he knows it. Friedrich Jeckeln, who would later be responsible for the massacre of more than 100,000 Jews in the Baltic area, he wrote to Himmler in the 1930s, "Only when Germany is free will I be able to make amends for all that the decay of our nation and homeland has caused." He owed Himmler his way out of bankruptcy from a disastrous second wedding from despair. He did not forget that debt. On June 30th, 1934, the night of the Long Knives, Himmler ordered the murder of two men who had built his career. Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, had been Himmler's first political godfather within the party, the man who had integrated him into the NSDAP's power structures in the mid-1920s. Gregor Strasser, the party's former propaganda chief, had been equally instrumental in Himmler's gain of positions of authority. He killed them without hesitation. The regime's official narrative presented the operation as the crushing of a putsch planned by Röhm. It was a lie. What occurred was a political purge designed to eliminate the SA as a rival force and consolidate state power in the hands of the Hitler-Himmler Wehrmacht coalition. The SA had 4.5 million members at the time, 9 times as many as in January 1933. Röhm demanded a second revolution that would transform his people's army into the heart of the Reich's armed forces. The army generals, who saw this as an existential threat, and Hitler, who needed the alliance with the professional military, decided to act. Himmler was the executor. His SS units, under the orders of Major Theodor Eicke, the same one who would run the concentration camp system, arrested and executed Röhm in cell 474 of Stadelheim prison on July 1st. When Röhm was offered a gun to kill himself, he refused. Eicke and his assistant Michael Lippert entered the cell and shot him twice. In total, between 150 and 200 people were executed in those days. Among them, Gregor Strasser, murdered in his cell in the Berlin Gestapo. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and his wife, L. General Ferdinand von Bredow, the music critic Eduard Schmidt, killed by mistake when he was mistaken for someone with the same surname. 2 weeks later, on July 20th, 1934, Hitler signed the decree disassociating the SS from the SA and making it an autonomous organization, explicitly justifying it by the great services rendered in connection with the events of June 30th. Himmler had killed his masters, and the payment was independent control of the Reich's apparatus of terror. In a subsequent speech to Gestapo personnel, Himmler described June 30th as the worst day that can happen to a soldier in his life. Having to shoot your own comrades, he said, is the most bitter experience a person can or should have. The decency of his language, that vocabulary of moral decorum and suffering, contrasts unbearably with the fact itself. Between November 1933 and April 1934, in less than 6 months, Himmler became head of the political police of each of the German states, one after the other. The method was always the same. First, identify local leaders who had problems with undisciplined SAS. Second, to offer these leaders the solution. To put the SS at their service, with the guarantee of order and discipline that the SA could not offer. Third, to incorporate the key people of each local police apparatus into the SS, thus creating a debt of personal loyalty. Fourth, to formally obtain the appointment as head of the political police. In Hamburg, for example, Himmler had a personal relationship with Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann since 1927. He helped him appoint Wilhelm Bolz, one of his longtime acquaintances, as chief of police. He appointed the new head of the political police, Bruno Streckenbach, as a member of the SS. He gave Kaufmann himself the rank of SS Oberführer. When all this was in place, the formal transfer of the political police to the SS on November 24, 1933, was pure bureaucratic formality. The only serious obstacle was Prussia, Germany's largest state, where Hermann Göring controlled the Gestapo with an iron fist. Here, Himmler needed more time and more maneuvers. He infiltrated his men into the corps personnel. He accumulated compromising material on Rudolf Diels, the head of the Prussian Gestapo. He coordinated with Göring against Interior Minister Frick. In April 1934, he obtained his appointment as inspector of the secret state police in Prussia. 4 months later, he had real operational control. By June 17, 1936, with his appointment as Reichsführer SS und Chef der Deutschen Polizei, Reichsführer SS and Chief of the German Police, Himmler had concentrated in his person control over absolutely all the bodies of state security: Gestapo, SD, law enforcement police, intelligence services, everything. Never before in the modern history of Europe had a single civilian man accumulated such control over the instruments of coercion of the state. On March 20, 1933, 6 weeks after Hitler came to power, Himmler called a press conference in Munich as the city's accidental police chief. He announced the opening of an internment camp for political prisoners on the grounds of a former gunpowder factory in Dachau, on the outskirts of the city. There would be capacity for 5,000 prisoners. Investigations into the length of protective custody, the euphemism for arbitrary detention without charge or trial, would simply delay police work. Therefore, each consultation would automatically mean an extra day in the field. The first few weeks, the camp was guarded by the Munich police. On April 2nd, Himmler transferred custody to the SS. On April 11th, when the police left the compound with more than 200 prisoners inside, the SS unleashed a wave of violence that cost the lives of 4 Jewish prisoners in a matter of days. Records showed that the commander, Hilmar Weckler, had established a kind of internal martial law with a field court that could hand down death sentences. The Munich prosecutor's office has launched an investigation. Prosecutor Wintersberger personally confronted Himmler with photographs of the disfigured corpses. The investigation was politically blocked. Weckler was replaced. His successor was Theodor Eicke, a man Himmler had found in the same situation as so many others, broke, with a criminal record, rejected by everything and completely dependent on Himmler's protection. Eicke introduced to Dachau what would become known as the Dachau model: strict separation of the camp from the outside, codified system of physical punishment, forced labor, fierce discipline for guards, and the appearance of an orderly regime that concealed the reality of arbitrary terror. Eicke's disciplinary and penal code declared that any prisoner who made political statements designed to provoke agitation would be hanged as an agitator by right of revolutionary law. Any prisoner who resisted would be killed on the spot as a mutineer. Murders were systematically recorded as suicides or escape attempts. Himmler knew it. It was he who signed the falsified reports that were to be sent to the Bavarian Ministry of Internal Affairs, explaining the deaths. In January 1934, he invited party chiefs and Gauleiters to visit Dachau. The visit was presented as proof of the order and normality of the field. In March 1934, the Prime Minister of Bavaria, Ludwig Siebert, after his visit, sent him a letter congratulating him on the conditions of the model prison camp. The letter was published in the German press. In November 1933, while still consolidating his control over the German police services, Himmler found a building that fit perfectly with his fantasies about the Germanic order he wanted to build: Wewelsburg Castle, a 17th-century triangular fortress near Paderborn in Westphalia, which the Buren district could no longer maintain. On the 22nd of September 1934, the castle was formally transferred to Himmler in a solemn ceremony. In his initial instructions, he described it as exactly suitable for his purposes. The official purpose was an SS leadership school. It soon became something more. From 1936 onwards, Wewelsburg began to transform into a place of personal worship. Himmler visited the castle dozens of times, sometimes staying for several days. In May 1938, he summoned the highest SS commanders there, including Sepp Dietrich, Eicke, Wolf, Dalueg, and Heydrich, for a staff meeting. In November 1938, he announced that an annual Gruppenführer conference would henceforth be held at the castle, with solemn oaths for new appointments. What was planned inside was more difficult to classify. He ordered the installation of the Gruppenführer Hall, decorated with the heraldic shields of his highest officers. Those who did not have a family coat of arms were instructed to order one, and a crypt in the castle tower. He ordered that the skull rings that were to be returned to the Reichsführer SS after the wearer's death be kept in a special closet in Wewelsburg. He designed a planetarium. He planned a treasure trove of gold and silver for hard times. He wanted for his room a long, narrow gobelin that represents a young, virginal woman, future mother. In January 1939, he ordered that publications about Wewelsburg be suppressed as much as possible. Grandiose expansion works continued until the end of the war, carried out in part by prisoners of the Niederhagen Auxiliary concentration camp, where between 1941 and 1943, more than 1,200 people died of exhaustion, disease, and brutal treatment. The architect, Hermann Bartels, drew up plans for a monumental complex that would have made Wewelsburg the geopolitical center of the future Germanic Europe. It was never completed. But what did exist in those walls was something more disturbing than any architectural project: the physical materialization of the pagan religion that Himmler was trying to build to replace Christianity. In October 1934, Himmler added to his staff of the Department of Race and Settlement a retired Imperial Austrian Army colonel named Karl Maria Willigut. He was 66 years old. Within the SS, he operated under the name Weisthor. Willigut claimed to be the bearer of the tradition of the ancestral clan Assa, and also the last representative of a secret Germanic royalty. He claimed to possess, thanks to mediumistic abilities, the ability to contact his ancestors and access hidden knowledge thousands of years old. Years earlier, in 1903, he had dedicated a book entitled The Runes of Seyfried to him. His recent record included 3 years of psychiatric internment in Salzburg and a legal interdiction pronounced in 1925. Himmler knew it, or at least he eventually knew, and it didn't matter. Willigut wrote essays for the Reichsführer SS on prehistory, religious questions, and sent him poems of his own composition. He proposed to introduce an ancient Germanic religion into Germany to replace Christianity. He transmitted to him what he claimed to be occult knowledge transmitted orally by the Assawana clan, the 9 commandments of God, the last of which read, "God is beginning without end, the universe. He is perfection in nothingness and yet all in 3 times threefold knowledge of all things." Himmler himself, in May 1940, wrote to the director of the Ahnenerbe, Walter Wüst, to ask him to investigate throughout Norse Germanic Aryan culture the representation of lightning, Thor's hammer, the god's axe in lightning. He wanted, he wrote, that all evidence be collected in images, sculptures, writings, or legends, because he was convinced that it was not natural thunder and lightning, but an ancient and highly developed weapon that our ancestors possessed, naturally only a few, namely the Aesir, the gods, and which involved an extraordinary knowledge of electricity. In 1936, Himmler promoted Willigut to the rank of SS Brigadeführer as a token of personal esteem. In 1939, he removed him, partly because Hitler had made a public statement against the occult, and partly because he had discovered psychiatric internment. But he did not cut off the relationship completely. He kept in his own safe the skull ring that Willigut had to return when he left the SS. He continued to consult him on symbolic matters in 1940 and 1941. Longerich points to a conclusion that is difficult to dispute. Himmler's fascination with the occult was genuine, but it was subordinated to a utilitarian logic. If the occult was useful in constructing the mythology of the SS, it was welcome. If it could be politically embarrassing, and the Willigut affair clearly demonstrated this, it was dismissible. In July 1935, Himmler founded the strangest research organization ever funded by a modern state, the Deutsches Ahnenerbe, German ancestral heritage. Its stated mission was to investigate the space, spirit, actions, and legacy of the Nordic Indo-Germanic race by exact scientific methods. By 1939, the Ahnenerbe had 137 researchers on the payroll and another 82 support workers. It had 59 distinct departments ranging from prehistoric archaeology to runology, folklore, botany, meteorology, caving, and occult science research. Some projects were simply absurd. The Ahnenerbe funded expeditions to prove that the Sumerians were actually Germanic. He funded research to prove that the pyramids of the Canary Islands were the work of a Nordic race. His departments included one dedicated to dowsing, the location of water and minerals by means of rods, and another dedicated to what he called folk tales and sagas. He organized an expedition to Iceland to film the lives of peasants as a token of the survival of ancient Germanic purity. But the Ahnenerbe also had teeth. Its staff acted, according to Heather Pringle in the Master Plan, 2006, as inquisitor, censor, and confiscator. In 1938, they took from the Munich Gestapo valuable bibliographic collections of Jewish owners. They pressured German universities to get Ahnenerbe academics to hold professorships. They suppressed archaeological publications that contradicted their theses. They confiscated archaeological pieces, manuscripts, and works of art in the occupied territories. Himmler followed his work with obsessive attention. In 1939, he asked them to investigate how quickly great achievements in German history have been made to use as a measure of comparison with Hitler's rule. He wrote comments in the margins of his reports. When the results contradicted his previous theories, he rejected them and called for further research. The Tibet expedition of 1938 to 1939, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer and documented in the German Federal Archives, illustrates the extent of this delusion. Schaefer spent months in the Himalayas measuring Tibetan skulls, collecting botanical samples and filming local rituals. Himmler expected evidence that Tibetans retained traces of Aryan blood from an ancient civilization. The results were scientifically null. But what began as ridiculous pseudoscience took on a criminal dimension when the Ahnenerbe began to supervise medical experiments on human beings in concentration camps. That story comes later. In December 1935, Himmler founded the Lebensborn Association, Fountain of Life, as a response to what he defined as the moral scandal of bourgeois sexual hypocrisy. The idea behind the Lebensborn was simple and disturbing in equal proportions. If SS men died in the war, leaving only 1 or 2 sons, the Germanic race would suffer irreparable loss. The solution was to create facilities where unmarried women of proper Nordic blood could give birth in absolute confidentiality, with medical and financial support from the state, without the social stigma of the illegitimate child. The first Lebensborn maternity home opened in August 1936 in Steinhöring in Upper Bavaria. By the start of the war, there were 6 more. The medical director was the Himmler's former family doctor in Munich, Gregor Ebner, a member of the same university fencing fraternity as Heinrich and a personal friend of his. Admitted mothers had to pass a rigorous racial examination by SS doctors, who followed the same criteria as those who were candidates for marriage with members of the corps. The doctor was forbidden to reveal the identity of the father even under normal medical circumstances, except in a special obligation imposed by the Reichsführer SS. In cases of special circumstances, Himmler reserved the right to keep both the birth and the identity of the father completely secret. The financing of the Lebensborn came from compulsory contributions from members of the SS. Those who did not have children paid more. Those who had 4 or more, legitimate or illegitimate, were exempt. In October 1939, in the midst of the invasion of Poland, Himmler issued his famous Order of Procreation, Zeugungsbefehl as the Wehrmacht sarcastically called it, explicitly exhorting soldiers to have children out of wedlock before dying in combat. The text literally read, "Beyond the limits of bourgeois laws and conventions that may be necessary in other circumstances, it can be, even outside marriage, a noble task, undertaken not with frivolity but with profound moral seriousness, for German women and girls of good blood to become mothers of the children of soldiers going to war. The commander-in-chief of the army, Walter von Brauchitsch, discussed the order with Himmler in February 1940 with visible discomfort. It caused more scandal in military circles than the mass murders of Polish civilians perpetrated by the SS itself in the previous months. During the years of occupation, the Lebensborn program was extended to conquered territories. In Norway, 6 maternity homes were established where an estimated 6,000 children were born to German soldiers and Norwegian women. A similar system was organized in the Netherlands. In Poland and other territories occupied in the east, the Lebensborn was also used for something radically different: the kidnapping of children. On October 4, 1943, before the Gruppenführers gathered in Poznan, Himmler stated unambiguously, "If we find in the East any good blood of our race, we will take it, and if necessary, we will steal the children and raise them ourselves." It was not rhetoric, it was ongoing politics. Since 1941, officials from the Central Office of Race and Settlement and Lebensborn have systematically scoured the occupied territories of Poland, Ukraine and the Netherlands to identify children with Nordic physical features: blonde or light brown hair, blue or grey eyes, straight nose, proportional height. Those who passed the racial selection were separated from their families. In the case of Lidis, the Czech village razed to the ground in retaliation for the murder of Reinhard Heydrich in June 1942. The 88 children whose fathers had been shot and whose mothers had been sent to concentration camps were transferred to a camp of the Central Relocation Office in Łódź. 7 of them were identified as fit for Germanization. The other 81 were deported to the Chelmno extermination camp and killed. In June 1942, Himmler issued explicit guidelines for action against partisans, which included the men of the guilty families, in many cases even all of the clan, must be executed. The women of these families should be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. The children must be taken out of their homeland and concentrated in the part of the Gau belonging to the Reich. At least 4,500 children from the Zamość district in Poland, whose parents had been sent to the Majdanek camp as slave labor, were transported to the Reich for Germanization. In the occupied territories generally, more than 10,000 children of German soldiers with local women were collected and integrated into Nazi party welfare institutions. Himmler was also thinking of the children of German soldiers with Russian women. Hitler had pointed out the problem. Probably between 1.5 million children had been fathered by German soldiers on Soviet territory. Himmler planned to identify them, examine them racially, and bring the good-blooded to Germany. He left those of poor blood behind. But even that seemed harmful to him, because we can't know what can emerge from his blood in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th generation. Another of the notes of that same speech, collected in a second register, mentions the eradication of unwanted offspring. In August 1941, during a visit to Minsk, Himmler personally witnessed a mass execution on the outskirts of the city. He arrived accompanied by Wolf, Prutzmann, and the filmmaker Walter Frenz, the Führer's personal photographer, who probably filmed the trial. What they saw were groups of 8 to 10 police or security officers shooting prisoners, including women in turn. A lieutenant in the criminal police who led one of the platoons testified after the war. After the first shot, Himmler approached the pit and personally looked inside, pointing out that there was still someone alive. He said, "Lieutenant, shoot that one." I obeyed him. Himmler stood by me as I did it. For Himmler and his entourage, it was all just a spectacle. Himmler then spoke to the members of the firing squads. He told them that while the shots were a heavy burden for them, they were necessary in the war of ideologies. According to the testimony of Otto Bradfisch, head of Einsatzkommando 8, Himmler claimed on that occasion that the Führer had given the order to shoot all Jews and that they had to be obeyed without exception. What Himmler saw in Minsk also disturbed him in practical terms. Mass shootings created logistical, psychological, and political problems. The shooters suffered serious psychic disturbances. Mass graves could be discovered. A more efficient method had to be found. On the same day of his visit to the psychiatric hospital in Nowinki, northwest of Minsk, Himmler gave instructions to kill his 120 patients by gas. 5 weeks later, a police unit executed the order. Experiments with Zyklon B gas began at the Soviet prisoner of war camp of Auschwitz in September 1941. The first use was with 600 Soviet prisoners and 250 patients from the camp hospital. On August 20, 1942, while visiting Auschwitz, Himmler witnessed the complete process of selecting and gassing a transport of Dutch Jews. He ordered the program to be expanded. By the end of 1941, the first extermination facilities in Belzec and Chelmno were operational. Sobibor and Treblinka would follow in 1942. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the 4 crematoriums with gas chambers became fully operational in 1943. The system that Himmler had built step by step from Dachau in 1933 to those furnaces had taken exactly 10 years to reach its final form. On October 4, 1943, at the Grand Hotel in Poznan, before the assembled SS Gruppenführers in conference, Himmler delivered the most extraordinary speech of World War II. He spoke for hours about the military and political situation. Then he came to what he called a very serious chapter. He said exactly this: "Today I am going to refer with total frankness to a very serious matter. We can now mention it among ourselves with all openness, and yet we will never speak of it in public. I'm referring to the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. Most of you know what it means to see 100 corpses together, or 500 or 1,000. To have endured that and, with exceptions of human weakness, to have remained decent, that has hardened us. This is an unwritten page which will never be written, and yet glorious of our history." 2 days later, he spoke to the leaders of Gau and the Reich. There he added, "I did not consider it justified to exterminate men, that is, to kill them or have them killed, and then to let their children grow up to avenge our children and grandchildren. The difficult decision had to be made, to make these people disappear from the face of the earth." The purpose was clear, according to Longerish. Himmler wanted to turn his audience into accomplices. Those who listened to the speech could no longer plead ignorance or distance from the crime. They knew, and when they knew, they were bound. As a further guarantee, he ordered a special list of Gruppenführers who had not been present at the speech of October 4th to be drawn up for separate reporting. The text of the 2 speeches in Poznan was recorded. The recordings survived the war. They were reproduced at the Nuremberg trials. They are one of the few times in history that the organizer of a genocide described its workings in his own words, in real time, bluntly. Between 1942 and 1945, under the auspices of the Ahnenerbe and under the direct supervision of Himmler's personal physician, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, a former high school classmate in Landshut, SS-affiliated researchers conducted experiments on human subjects in various concentration camps. At Dachau, Hauptsturmführer Dr. Sigmund Rasche subjected prisoners to high-altitude pressure tests in low-pressure chambers designed to simulate the conditions faced by Luftwaffe pilots. The subjects lost consciousness, suffered brain hemorrhages, and died. Rasche documented meticulously the processes, including autopsies of the deceased. His reports reached Himmler directly. Also at Dachau, between October 1942 and May 1943, hypothermia experiments were conducted. Prisoners were immersed in icy water or exposed to extreme cold to determine the limits of human survival and the most effective methods of resuscitation. Himmler was informed and personally interested in the results, particularly in the possibilities of warming by animal heat, that is, by bodily contact with women. In Ravensbrück and in other fields, Dr. Gebhardt conducted experiments with sulfonamides on artificially infected wounds of prey, most of them Polish political prisoners, to compare the efficacy of antibiotics. The wounds were inoculated with gangrene and tetanus bacteria. The results, with high mortality, were sent to Himmler and the Oberkommando of the Wehrmacht. Gebhardt was the director of the Hohenlüchen Sanatorium in the Uckermark region, where prominent personalities of the regime were also treated. Himmler's mistress, Hedwig Potthast, gave birth to their first child there in 1942. Himmler's chief of staff, Karl Wolff, recovered in Hohenlüchen from a nervous breakdown in 1943. After the war, Gebhardt was tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trials in 1947 and sentenced to death. He was executed on June 2, 1948. At trial, prosecutors presented correspondence showing that Himmler had not only approved the experiments, but had personally intervened in their design. In August 1942, he wrote to Dr. Rascher to ask specific questions about the mechanisms of death by hypothermia. It was a methodological curiosity, not a moral one. The suffering of the victims does not appear in their correspondence as a relevant factor. Himmler's racial obsession manifested itself in regulations of a meticulousness bordering on the absurd. Every member of the SS had to prove his Aryan ancestry until 1750. For SS leaders, the requirement was extended until 1650. Any ancestor of non-Aryan origin meant automatic exclusion, but verification was not limited to papers. Each candidate passed a physical racial test that assessed overall build, body build, and racial assessment. The latter category allowed the examiner, usually a racially trained SS doctor, to offset negative characteristics with a positive overall appearance, which meant that the examiner's subjectivity had definitive weight. In 1939, Himmler introduced a detailed racial file that listed the characteristics which are present chiefly when there is blood of another race present, including jet black hair or hooked nose. At his express request, the Greek nose, with little or no indentation at the root, was added specifically to avoid confusion. The expected minimum size pattern was 1.70 meters. Himmler measured himself, 174.5 centimeters barefoot, as he noted. It was within limits. Longerish points out with dry irony that a sober assessment of Himmler's own physical characteristics, round rather than oval face, wide nose, recessive chin, drooping rather than upright complexion, would have placed him at or below average according to his examiner's own criteria. At SS Oberabschnitt Elbe in 1935 and 1936, 75 or 80% of the candidates were accepted. The system that Himmler publicly presented as an ultra-rigorous sieve, asserting in 1937 to Wehrmacht officers that only the 10 and 15% of candidates were admitted, was in practice considerably more permissive. What mattered was not scientific coherence, but the maintenance of the fiction of the elite. In 1927, Heinrich Himmler met Margarete Boden, a nurse 7 years his senior, divorced co-owner of a small nursing clinic. They married in July 1928. The small chicken farm they bought in Waldtrudering was an economic disaster, like almost everything Himmler tried before politics. In 1929, the year of his appointment as Reichsführer SS, he was sold. The marriage was never warm. Margaret's diary, fragments of which are preserved in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, offers a picture of an intelligent and frustrated woman who saw her husband less and less. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, she wrote, "Despite the happiness that marriage brings, I have had to do without many things because H is almost never at home and her life is all work." In early 1936, a young secretary named Hedwig Potthast began working in Himmler's office. In 1940, they began a relationship. Himmler got her a house and maintained the relationship for the rest of the war, although he never divorced Margarete. Potthast bore him 2 children, a boy, Helge, born in February 1942 at the Hohenlüchen Sanatorium, and a daughter, Nanette Dorothea, born in July 1944. The double life was fully known to the inner circle of the SS. Himmler did not hide it from his subordinates. What he did try to do was that no one could use that information against him, and for this he had a principle. When in disciplinary or criminal proceedings conjugal infidelities of his officers came to light, It was Himmler's policy not to inform the wives, for the sake of the maintenance of the marriage. The legitimate daughter Gudrun, nicknamed Puppy, was Himmler's great love. He sent him letters from the battlefronts, photographs of his inspections, small gifts. His relationship with her was, according to all available testimonies, genuinely affectionate. Gudrun was aware of his father's activities. After the war, she was briefly detained by Allied forces. She lived until 2018, being active for decades in neo-Nazi organizations helping ex-SS. Himmler's anti-Christianity was, according to Peter Longerich, the true center of his cosmology, deeper even than his anti-Semitism. Longerich writes, "He was basically much more interested in Christianity. The conflict with the Christian world in which he had grown up had for him a truly existential significance. The reasons were twofold. On the one hand, Christian sexual morality directly contradicted the demographic revolution that Himmler planned. The prohibition of sex outside marriage, the condemnation of illegitimacy, celibacy as a virtue. All this was, in his view, an obstacle to the reproduction of Germanic good blood. On the other hand, the Christian principle of mercy was incompatible with the severity that demanded the extermination of subhumans. Himmler believed that sex was viewed by the Church as sin, and that such an attitude had retarded his own sexual development. I cannot help but think that the Catholic Church is responsible for the danger of homosexuality, he said, linking his own religious upbringing to what he called the threat of homosexual temptations. In strictly biographical terms, the man who made the persecution of homosexuals one of the central missions of his police apparatus, and who sent between 10,000 and 15,000 people to the camps on this charge, attributed his own adolescent sexual insecurities to Catholic repression. To replace Christianity, he planned a pagan Germanic cult. The SS introduced the summer solstice as an official holiday, the Yule, to replace Christmas. Burials of SS members were conducted with their own ceremonials rather than conventional religious rites. The sun salutation and other symbolic practices of supposedly Nordic roots were introduced. Himmler had kept for himself reflections on reincarnation. He believed in rebirth within the clan and on immortality as the perpetuation of blood. In private, he contemplated the possibility that historical figures such as Genghis Khan, Lenin, or Stalin were actually carriers of lost Aryan genes, which would explain their leadership capabilities. This theory, which Himmler mentioned in his speeches during the Eastern Campaign, was also a way of maintaining open the possibility that the Soviet enemy could be as formidable as it was, because if it was, there must be Germanic blood in its veins. In 1933, there was a concentration camp in Dachau. By 1945, the SS-controlled camp system comprised more than 1,000 facilities of different kinds: large main camps, forced labor subcamps, transit camps, extermination camps, and a network of satellite establishments covering virtually all of occupied Europe. The architecture of that system was designed directly by Himmler. From 1934, when he appointed Theodor Eicher as concentration camp inspector, he worked systematically to expand the Dachau model to each new facility. Each camp had the same disciplinary and criminal code. Each field was sealed from the outside. Each camp had its own SS Guard units, the Totenkopfverbände or skull units, financed directly by the Reich. The paradox of the system was that Himmler invested real effort in maintaining the appearance of internal regularity. It forbade guards from making life or death decisions on their own. That was the prerogative of the camp administration. It internally prosecuted guards who committed unauthorized excesses. The purpose of this discipline was not to reduce the suffering of prisoners — mortality was devastating and calculated — but to maintain total control and prevent the leakage of information to the outside. Himmler personally visited Dachau on multiple occasions, including a May 1935 visit that was photographed and in which he appears smiling among the barracks. In 1934, he invited business leaders from the Reichsführer SS Circle of Friends for a guided tour. In 1936, he did the same with senior executives of Siemens, e.g. Farben, Deutsche Bank, and other private companies that financed the activities of the SS. He showed them a facility that, in his words, was strict but fair. By 1944, when the camps in the east were beginning to be evacuated in the face of the advancing Red Army, Himmler ordered the prisoners to march on foot into the interior of the Reich. The guards killed anyone who stayed behind. In that winter's death columns, cold, exhaustion, starvation, and gunfire killed tens of thousands of people in weeks. The system that had begun with a camp for 5,000 prisoners in a gunpowder factory in Bavaria ended up being the infrastructure for the largest mass murder in history. In November 1938, Himmler was in Munich for the commemoration of the failed putsch of 1923. On November 9th, after the death of the diplomat Ernst vom Rath in Paris, murdered by the young Herschel Grünspan in retaliation for the deportation of his Polish family, Goebbels ignited the spark of the pogrom at the meeting of old fighters in Munich City Hall. Himmler was present. What he did, or didn't do, during the following hours is a matter of historiographical debate. What is on record is that around midnight he was with Hitler in his Munich apartment when the first reports came in about the extent of the riots. It was then that Himmler instructed the head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, in Berlin that the police should not obstruct actions against Jews but should prevent looting and disorganized violence, and that the concentration camps prepared to receive between 20,000 and 30,000 prisoners. That night, between 25,000 and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested. 91 people were killed in the direct violence, probably an underestimate. Hundreds of people committed suicide. Many of the detainees who spent months in concentration camps did not survive. The pogrom marked a turning point. Forced emigration, which had been the predominant policy until then, showed its limitations. International negotiations to facilitate the departure of German Jews became more difficult, not easier. What the pogrom had shown was that the state could mobilize mass violence against Jews without collapsing the overall social order. Himmler also drew another conclusion, which would be documented in a note for a February 1939 speech. The radical solution of the Jewish problem is impelling Jewry to fight us, if necessary, by unleashing a world war. It was an inversion of cause and effect that he himself would practice to the end. The Jews were responsible for whatever consequences their own persecutions generated. On September 3, 1939, 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, Himmler issued an order: Polish armed insurgents captured on the spot were to be shot on the spot. 4 days later, he transmitted by telephone that the execution should be carried out by the police and not by the army. The Einsatzgruppen, 7 units of between 200 and 500 men each, entered Poland with the mission of neutralizing the leadership elements of the Polish society. In October 1939, Heydrich demanded that the liquidation of the main Poles already underway be concluded by November 1st. The whites included the Polish intelligentsia, the clergy, the nobility, the military, and the Jews. The figures are difficult to establish precisely, but the most rigorous estimates calculate that during combat operations and the first months of occupation, the SS, the police, and in some cases also the Wehrmacht, killed tens of thousands of Polish civilians. General Johannes von Blaskowitz, military commander of the East, presented 2 memoranda in November 1939 and January 1940 to the army commander denouncing the atrocities. In one passage he wrote, "Above all, the impression is imposed that the leadership of the SS is acting in accordance with a plan of systematic annihilation of the Polish people." When von Brauchitsch relayed the complaints to Himmler at meetings in January and February 1940, the Reichsführer admitted mistakes, but insisted that he was acting with Hitler's knowledge. In March, he gave a lecture to senior army commanders in which he downplayed reports of atrocities. The generals, who had expressed moral indignation, accepted the explanation and turned the page. The impunity that Himmler established in Poland was the model for everything that came after. The principle was fixed. The SS apparatus could act outside military jurisdiction. The crimes of SS officers did not reach the ordinary courts, and Hitler's authority covered any act committed in his name. On June 22, 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the most brutal phase of the war of extermination that Himmler had conceived began. The Einsatzgruppen that operated in the East in 1941 to 1942 were divided into four main groups, A, B, C, and D, that followed the various German army groups. Their orders, according to the testimonies of their own members in subsequent trials, included the liquidation of Jews, Soviet political commissars, and other elements hostile to the Reich. Himmler himself visited the Eastern Front on multiple occasions during those months, personally supervising the operations. In July 1941, he witnessed the shooting of Soviet prisoners in Brest-Litovsk. In August, the mass execution on the outskirts of Minsk described in Dato 13. The Einsatzgruppen situation reports, the famous Einsatzgruppen reports, numbered 1 to 195 for the period June 1941 to April 1942, document killings systematically, with figures accumulating week by week. By October 1941, Einsatzgruppen A had killed more than 100,000 people. The Jäger report, signed by the commander of the Einsatzkommando 3, Karl Jäger, documents the annihilation of 137,346 people in Lithuania between July and November 1941, in a list that includes dates, places, and breakdown by categories: men, women, children. In the autumn of 1941, the SS Cavalry Brigade under the command of Hermann Fegelein, who coincidentally would later become Eva Braun's brother-in-law, operated in the marshy areas of Belarus. In his final report of September 1941, he reported 14,178 looters shot, 1,001 partisans shot, and 699 members of the Red Army. The euphemism for plunderers corresponded mostly to Jews. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski himself, High Commander of the SS and police in Central Russia, suffered a physical and mental breakdown in March 1942 as a result of his participation in these operations. His doctor, SS General Robert Grawitz, informed Himmler that Bach-Zelewski arrived at treatment completely exhausted after depressions and hallucinations related to the shootings of Jews that he himself had ordered. Himmler wrote back with a letter assuring him that he had never doubted that he was your old self, old. In the final months of the war, while the apparatus he had built continued to function, the last transports of Hungarian Jews arrived at Auschwitz in May and June 1944. Himmler began to explore channels for negotiating with the Western Allies. His emissaries in Sweden and Switzerland contacted representatives of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and the International Red Cross. In October 1944, he met personally with Jean-Marie Mouzy, former president of the Swiss Confederation. In exchange for foreign currency or war materials, he offered the liberation of groups of Jews from concentration camps. In January 1945, 1,200 people from Theresienstadt were effectively transferred to Switzerland. At the same time, in April 1945, through his private masseur Felix Kersten and the representative of the Congress Worldwide Jewish Norbert Masseur that secretly flew to Berlin in the middle of the war to meet him, Himmler tried to establish contact with the Allied intelligence services. On April 23, 1945, without informing Hitler, Himmler met with Count Volker Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross in the city of Lübeck. He offered to surrender to the Western Allies, excluding the Soviet Union. Bernadotte conveyed the offer. The Allies rejected it. When news of the offer was broadcast by the BBC, Hitler found out. He called Himmler the most colossal traitor in all German history and expelled him from all his posts. Up to that point, in the final days of the Third Reich, Himmler had been the second most powerful man in the Reich. On May 2, 1945, Himmler shaved off his moustache, donned the uniform of a Wehrmacht sergeant, and joined a group of refugees trying to cross Allied lines. He was carrying forged documents in the name of Heinrich Himmler. On 21st May, he was arrested at a British military police checkpoint near Bremervörde. I had been walking for 2 days. On May 23, 1945, at the British Forces Interrogation Camp 31 near Lüneburg, Captain Tom Sylvester routinely received detainees. When 3 men in the group demanded to be seen immediately, which was unusual since most prisoners did their best not to attract attention, he sent them in. The shortest of the 3, sickly-looking, in threadbare civilian clothes, took off a black patch covering his right eye and put on pole-rimmed glasses. Then he calmly introduced himself. Heinrich Himmler, former Reichsführer SS and chief of the German police, former commander of the Wehrmacht Reserve Army, former Reich Minister of the Interior. During the search, Sylvester found in Himmler's jacket a small box with a glass ampule of colorless liquid. Himmler explained that it was medicine for stomach cramps. A second identical box was found moments later. Sylvester, suspecting the presence of a third blister hidden in some body cavity, ordered a thorough search that included all the openings of the body except the mouth. They did not want Himmler to swallow it. He was served cheese sandwiches and tea. He ate them with apparent normality. A higher-ranking intelligence officer arrived in Lüneburg that afternoon, and formal questioning began. Around midnight, he was transferred to the headquarters of the British Second Army in the same city for a medical examination. The doctor, Captain C.J. Wells, attempted to check Himmler's mouth. As he did so, Himmler turned his head and bit into the blister. It collapsed in seconds. 15 minutes after desperate attempts at resuscitation, it was all over. 3 days later, without a religious ceremony, without a coffin, without a tombstone, 4 British sergeants and an officer buried the body in an unmarked place on the outskirts of Lüneburg. The exact location was not publicly revealed. The man who for 12 years had controlled the most sophisticated terror apparatus in modern European history died biting his tongue to avoid a trial. The officer who had been demanding responsibility for his subordinates for their actions for years, who preached that a soldier's death was an honor, who mocked the suicides of SS members as an escape, died exactly like that, on the run. Longerich closes his analysis with a question that does not admit an easy answer: how to explain Himmler. The most comfortable answer, the anomalous monster, the aberration of history, does not hold up in the face of facts. The psychiatrist Gustave Gilbert, who interviewed the Nuremberg defendants, administered an intelligence test. Himmler would have obtained approximately 143 points. He was intelligent, cultured in the narrow sense of the Bavarian bourgeoisie of his time, with a genuine passion for reading. He was also an efficient manager, the ability to take a 280-man body and turn it into a 300,000-strong one in 3 years, while coherently building Europe's most comprehensive police system in parallel, required real organizational skills. He was meticulous to the point of ridicule. He sent instructions to his commanders about the toast and oatmeal flakes for the troops' breakfast. He had a file of indexed cards that recorded every gift he had given to each person and when. It forbade SS officers to use the Herr treatment among themselves. They had to wear rank, and required them to remove the glove before shaking hands when shaking. And at the same time, he was the architect of the system that killed approximately 11 million people, 6 million Jews, plus 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, 1.5 million non-Jewish Polish civilians, hundreds of thousands of Roma, tens of thousands of homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, the disabled. What makes Himmler's case so difficult to digest is precisely that he does not fit into the archetype of the madman or the sadist. He was a bureaucrat. His cruelty had a purpose. Their murders had ideological justification. And that justification, the idea that he was cleaning up Europe to build a higher, purer civilization, had been crafted with the same bureaucratic meticulousness with which he managed the payrolls of his subordinates. In the autumn of 1943, before the SS leaders in Poznan, he explained that what they were doing was a glorious page of our history, never written and never to be written. He was aware that the world, if it ever found out in detail, would not call him glory, and he did it anyway. That's the scariest thing, not the pathology. Deliberation. The man who organized the Holocaust was not crazy. I was convinced. And he believed until the end that he had acted with decency. On May 23, 1945, 4 British sergeants dug an unmarked grave somewhere in the Lower Saxony countryside. There were no flowers. There were no speeches. There was no family present. Somewhere in that nameless land rests what is left of Heinrich Luitpold Himmler, the second son of Professor Gebhard Himmler of Munich, the failed agronomy student, the amateur poet, the lover of chickens and farms, the voracious reader of Teutonic sagas, the father who sent photographs of his inspections to his daughter Gudrun, and the man who built Dachau, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec, the man who signed the orders of the Einsatzgruppen, the man who heard the reports of the death camps and asked if efficiency could be improved, the man who spoke before his generals about 100, 500, 1,000 corpses and called them a glorious page of history. History will not forget, and neither should it.